It was nearing midnight, and an unsettling silence cloaked the abandoned park, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. As Michael stepped cautiously onto the cracked pathway, he felt a chill run through his spine, as if the park itself were breathing, exhaling an aura of dread. Ahead, shrouded in shadows, stood the infamous statue of the Laughing Clown, a relic that the townspeople spoke of only in hushed voices. No one knew exactly when it had been placed there, or why it was left to rot in a corner of the forgotten playground, but whispers claimed that, at night, the clown's laughter could still be heard. Michael's flashlight flickered as he approached, casting a trembling light across the statue's grotesque face. The clown's eyes, wide and glassy, seemed to gleam with a life of their own, following his every step. The face was locked in a twisted grin, the painted red lips stretching impossibly wide, exposing rows of unnaturally sharp teeth. Its posture, hunched and almost eager, seemed as if it were leaning forward, waiting for him, welcoming him. Michael swallowed hard, feeling a strange pull, a morbid curiosity mixed with terror. He tried to convince himself it was just a statue, nothing more. Yet the atmosphere around it was dense and foreboding, like an invisible hand pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. As he drew closer, the air grew colder, and the distant sounds of the night faded into an eerie silence, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Suddenly, he heard it, a soft, raspy giggle that floated through the air, faint but unmistakable. Michael froze, his eyes locked on the statue, heart pounding. The laughter was low, taunting, as if the clown were sharing a twisted joke only it understood. His flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, he could swear the statue's head had turned slightly, its gaze now directly meeting his. He staggered back, a scream caught in his throat, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Just as he was about to turn and run, the laughter ceased, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in its wake. In the dim light, Michael noticed something odd at the clown's feet, a small, faded sign half buried in the dirt, reading, "Welcome back." He hadn't seen it before. Had it always been there, or had it somehow materialized just for him? He couldn't shake the feeling that the statue was mocking him, daring him to stay, to come closer. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but a strange force held him there, compelling him to confront the twisted, smiling face. The longer he stood there, the more he felt a suffocating sense of déjà vu, as if he had been here before, in another life, another nightmare. The wind began to pick up, whispering through the trees like a chorus of unseen voices. He thought he heard his own name carried on the breeze, distorted, as if called out from somewhere deep within the shadows. His hands trembled, and his flashlight slipped from his grip, clattering to the ground. In the brief darkness, he felt something brush against his shoulder, a light, almost playful touch. He spun around, but there was no one there. When he turned back, the statue's grin seemed wider, more sinister, and he felt the undeniable sense that he was not alone. Something ancient, something malevolent, lingered in the darkness, watching, waiting. As Michael stood frozen before the eerie statue, fragments of old, buried memories began to resurface, creeping into his mind like unwanted shadows. The Laughing Clown was more than a statue. It was a relic from his childhood, one he had long tried to forget. When he was young, his parents had taken him to this park often. He could almost hear the echo of their laughter mingling with the distant cries of other children. Yet, there was something else, something darker. He remembered being terrified of the statue even then, hiding behind his mother whenever they passed it. His parents had laughed, brushing off his fear as childish imagination, but the look in their eyes betrayed a hint of unease. Suddenly, a long-forgotten detail surfaced, a melody. It was a lullaby, soft and haunting, that his mother used to hum, especially on the nights he woke up screaming after dreaming of the clown. He could almost hear it now, faint but unmistakable, as if drifting from the shadows surrounding him. It was unsettlingly familiar, carrying with it a chill that gnawed at his bones. The song seemed to float through the park, weaving through the trees and echoing around him, filling the silence with a sinister nostalgia. It was as if the statue itself were humming it, summoning memories he had buried deep within, forcing him to confront them. Michael took a step back, his eyes fixed on the clown's unblinking stare. His heart pounded as a memory he had suppressed for years bubbled to the surface. He recalled a night when he had been left alone in the park for a few minutes, waiting for his parents to return. The air had been thick and still, and the shadows had seemed longer, darker. He had been drawn to the clown's statue then, too, unable to look away from its twisted grin. He remembered walking toward it, his small feet crunching on the gravel, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. When he'd gotten close, he heard it. Faint, nearly inaudible, but there. A whisper, calling his name in a voice that sounded eerily like his own. As he stared into the face of a statue now, he felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. The memories continued flooding back, each more disturbing than the last. He remembered at the time mentioning the strange incident to his parents, only for them to exchange uneasy glances before dismissing it as a product of his imagination. But even as a child, he had known better. He had sensed the unease in their voices, the way his mother's grip on his hand had tightened just a bit too much when they'd walked past the clown. That night, he had gone home with a strange scar on his hand, a small crescent-shaped mark that had no explanation. His parents claimed it was from a fall, but he couldn't remember falling. And now, standing here again, he felt a familiar, burning itch where that scar had once been. He looked down at his hand, and to his horror, the old scar was glowing faintly, as if awakening along with his memories. It pulsed with an eerie, rhythmic light, matching the sinister lullaby still echoing in his mind. He clutched his hand, trying to stop the burning sensation, but it only grew stronger. He felt as though the statue were feeding off his fear, drawing energy from the fragments of his past. Desperation clawed at him as he realized that whatever haunted this place had a hold on him, something it had latched onto all those years ago, something he had foolishly tried to ignore. As Michael fought to regain control, he noticed a faint engraving at the statue's base, one he was sure hadn't been there before. It read, "For those who remember, there is no escape." His breath caught as the realization dawned on him. The clown had been waiting for him, all this time, lying dormant, feeding off the fear he'd carried with him all these years. Now it had awakened, and it wanted him back. Michael's heart raced as he stumbled backward, the weight of his memories pressing down on him with relentless intensity. The pulsating scar on his hand burned as if it were alive, a searing reminder of the clown's hold on him. Desperation flooded his mind, and he looked around, searching for any sign of escape. But the park seemed to close in around him, the twisted trees looming like silent, watchful figures. The laughing clown's grin widened in the dim light, as though mocking his fear, daring him to make a move. In the midst of his panic, he felt something cold and metallic beneath his foot. Looking down, he saw a small, rusted locket half buried in the dirt, a keepsake he hadn't seen in years. Trembling, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of himself as a child, clinging to his mother's hand. She had given him this locket to keep him safe, a charm she'd insisted he wear after he first told her about the strange voices in the park. The memory flooded back with a force that nearly drove him to his knees. His mother's anxious eyes, the way she'd whispered a warning about things best left forgotten. He had worn the locket faithfully as a child, but over time, as he grew older, he had tucked it away, trying to leave the past behind. And now, here it was, waiting for him, like a token of an unfulfilled promise. A chilling thought crept into his mind. What if the locket held the key to ending this nightmare? What if, by offering it to the statue, he could free himself from its grasp? But the thought filled him with dread. The locket was his last tie to his mother, his only reminder of her after she had passed away. It held memories he cherished, moments he couldn't bear to lose. He clutched it tightly, torn between the overwhelming urge to be free and the fear of letting go of the one thing that anchored him to his past. The clown's eyes gleamed, as if it understood his inner conflict, as if it relished the agony of his impossible choice. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the shadows, soft yet commanding, "Sacrifice it, and you may walk away." The voice was familiar, but distorted, like an echo of his own thoughts twisted into something foreign and sinister. Michael's hands trembled as he held the locket, feeling the weight of his memories press down on him. He could feel his mother's comforting presence, the warmth of her hand, her whispered assurances that everything would be all right. The idea of losing those memories, of casting them away into the cold darkness, filled him with terror. But as he glanced at the statue, he realized that his time was running out. The clown's grin seemed wider, more malevolent, as if it were growing impatient, waiting for his decision. In that moment, Michael's mind raced through the consequences of each choice. He knew that if he kept the locket, the clown would continue to haunt him, its laughter echoing in his nightmares, a constant reminder of the terror he could never escape. But if he surrendered it, he feared he would lose a part of himself, a piece of his soul entwined with the memories of his mother. It was as though the clown demanded more than just a trinket. It wanted to feed on his grief, to devour the most precious parts of his past. As the weight of the decision bore down on him, Michael felt a wave of exhaustion. He could sense the clown's satisfaction, feeding off his torment, as though each moment of hesitation strengthened its hold on him. His mind flashed with images, his mother's face, her gentle smile, the sound of her laughter. Could he truly cast all of that away? And yet, could he bear the thought of living with this curse, of feeling the clown's laughter echoing in every dark corner of his life? As Michael stood there, clutching the locket, the park seemed to take on a life of its own. Shadows stretched and twisted, crawling across the ground like living tendrils, reaching toward him. The trees swayed without wind, their branches creaking, whispering in voices that sounded disturbingly human. The laughter of the clown, faint and taunting, echoed through the air, blending with the whispers. Every sound seemed amplified, filling the oppressive silence with a symphony of dread. It was as if the park itself was breathing, alive with dark intentions, waiting for him to take the final step into its grasp. He spun around, his eyes darting across the dark landscape, searching for any sign of escape. But wherever he looked, he found only shadows, deeper and more menacing than before. Then, just as he took a step back, he felt something brush against his shoulder, an icy, feather-light touch that sent a jolt of terror through his body. He whipped around, his heart hammering, but saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the air around him, circling like vultures waiting for their prey to falter. He tried to make out the words, but they were distorted, overlapping, almost mocking, yet undeniably familiar. It was as though the voices were calling from somewhere deep within his own mind, feeding on his darkest fears and insecurities. Desperately, Michael forced himself to face the statue again, trying to convince himself it was just a lifeless object, a twisted piece of stone and paint. But the longer he looked, the more he could swear that the clown's eyes were moving, subtly shifting to meet his gaze. The statue's face seemed to come alive in the darkness, the painted grin stretching wider, more sinister, as if it knew his every thought, his every fear. And then, just as his resolve began to falter, he heard it, a soft, hoarse whisper, as if the statue itself were speaking to him. The voice was chilling, scraping against his mind like nails on a chalkboard, sending shivers down his spine. "Do you remember, Michael?" the voice hissed, each word soaked in malice. "Do you remember what you left behind here?" Michael's blood ran cold. How could it know his name? How could it know about the memories he had tried so hard to forget? Panic surged through him, and he backed away, but the shadows seemed to close in around him, guiding him back toward the statue, trapping him within its grasp. He could feel a strange pull, an invisible force drawing him closer, as if the clown were reaching out to him from across the years, calling him back to a nightmare that had never truly ended. As he struggled against the invisible grip, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with flashes of long-buried memories. He saw himself as a child, standing before the statue, his tiny hand reaching out in innocent curiosity. And then darkness. A void in his memory, a piece of his past that had been ripped away, leaving only fear in its place. And now, as he stood there, he felt that same emptiness returning, clawing at his mind, as if the clown were peeling back the layers of his sanity, unearthing every dark thought he had buried. The whispers changed, becoming a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some mocking, others filled with rage. Michael clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices only grew louder, echoing inside his skull. He could hear his mother's voice among them, her tone filled with desperation, calling his name as though trying to warn him. The memory of her voice was sharp, cutting through the fog of fear, grounding him for a brief, fleeting moment. But just as quickly as it came, it was swallowed by the laughter of the clown, echoing through the park like a death knell. In that moment, Michael realized that the statue wasn't merely watching him, it was feeding on him, on his fear, his memories, his very essence. He could feel it burrowing into his mind, sifting through his past like scavenger, seeking out every painful memory, every fragment of grief and sorrow. It wanted him to suffer, to relive every nightmare he had ever tried to forget. And as he stood there, paralyzed by terror, he knew that this was only the beginning. The statue had him now, and it would not let go. Michael's breath came in shallow, panic gasps as he struggled to steady himself. The park was alive with a darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, and the air grew thick, stifling, pressing down on him as though invisible hands were wrapped around his throat. His vision blurred as shadows danced at the edges, flickering with ghostly shapes that seemed to taunt him, daring him to look closer. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum, a countdown to something he couldn't yet understand but instinctively feared. The longer he stood there, the more he felt reality slipping, twisting into something warped and nightmarish. He blinked, and suddenly the trees surrounding him were no longer mere trees. They appeared to shift, bending unnaturally, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers, reaching out toward him with a silent hunger. In their dark knots and grooves, he swore he could see faces, twisted in agony, silently screaming, their empty eyes following him as he backed away. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs felt leaden, as if the ground itself were holding him captive, feeding on his fear and drawing him deeper into the park's cursed embrace. Then, just ahead, he saw something that stopped his heart, a vision, faint yet unmistakable, of his mother. She was standing near the statue, her face obscured by shadows, her hand reaching out toward him. "Michael." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and yet it carried a weight that crushed him. He reached out instinctively, but as his fingers stretched toward her, her image began to dissolve, flickering like a dying flame. The edges of her figure darkened, and in an instant, she was gone, leaving only the grotesque clown statue in her place, grinning wider than ever, as if mocking his desperation. The vision triggered a torrent of memories and emotions he had long buried, each one a dagger twisting in his mind. The last words his mother had spoken to him, the warning she had given, all came rushing back. He felt himself slipping, his thoughts unsteady, his sense of reality crumbling. It was as though the statue, or whatever dark presence inhabited it, was seeping into his mind, peeling back layers of his sanity to expose his deepest fears, his most vulnerable memories. He began to see shadows shifting in the corners of his vision, vague, shifting shapes that seemed to mimic his movements, always just out of sight. A cold, creeping dread settled over him, and a realization began to take root. The statue wasn't just feeding on his fear, it was amplifying it, twisting it, creating illusions to push him to the very edge of madness. The park had become a distorted funhouse of his own mind, each fear magnified, each horror tailored to torment him personally. Michael's hand shook as he clutched the locket, a single reminder of his sanity amidst the madness. But even it felt heavier now, almost as if the statue's influence had tainted it, turning it from a source of comfort into a tool of manipulation. Then, the laughter began again. Not the faint, distant chuckle from before, but a deep, guttural laugh that reverberated through the ground beneath his feet, rattling his bones and filling his mind with a despair that felt endless. It was as though the statue were taunting him, whispering the darkest truths he had tried to ignore, pulling his nightmares into the open for him to confront. He tried to tell himself it wasn't real, that it was all an illusion, but the boundary between reality and nightmare was gone. The park had claimed him, and every sensation, every horrifying image felt as real as his own heartbeat. As he stumbled through the dark, his vision warped once more, and he saw glimpses of himself, reflections in the twisted surfaces around him. But each reflection was wrong, distorted, like a macabre version of himself with eyes wide with terror, face pale and hollow, as though already drained of life. The images followed him, mimicking his movements, but with a haunting, soulless gaze, reminding him that there would be no escape from this place, that he was doomed to become another echo in the darkness, another victim claimed by the statue's insatiable hunger for fear. And then, in a final moment of pure terror, he felt the first tendrils of surrender creeping into his mind, the creeping temptation to let go, to allow the darkness to consume him. Michael's mind teetered on the edge of oblivion, every rational thought swallowed by the primal fear that pulsed through his veins. He felt like he was being stripped of his own identity, his memories, his very sense of self. As he clung to the locket, he knew it was all that kept him anchored to reality, to the fragments of who he was. Yet even the locket, once a comforting relic of his mother's love, now felt cold and unfamiliar, as if tainted by the darkness that surrounded him. Then, in the silence, he heard it, a faint, whispered chant, low and rhythmic, as though it were the heartbeat of the park itself. The words were incomprehensible, guttural, but he felt them reverberate within his chest, filling him with a dread that went beyond fear. The statue of the clown seemed to loom larger in his vision, growing in stature, its grotesque grin stretching wider, the eyes glinting with an intelligence that felt disturbingly human. It was no longer just a statue. It was alive, and it was hungry. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and he watched in horror as cracks spiderwebbed from the base of the statue, radiating outward like veins. Dark mist seeped from the fractures, curling through the air like smoke, and the laughter started again, low, menacing, filling the park like a death knell. Michael felt himself drawn toward the statue, his feet moving of their own accord, as if he were a puppet under its control. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something ancient and unidentifiable. Suddenly, he was hit with a realization that almost brought him to his knees. The clown's spirit wasn't just an entity haunting the park. It was part of him, latched onto his fear and feeding off his memories, growing stronger with every second he spent there. This was not a mere haunting. It was a possession, a slow, deliberate merging of their beings. The clown had been waiting for him, lying dormant, feeding on his suppressed memories of terror, and now, with him so close, it was ready to consume him completely. A voice slithered into his mind, oily and serpentine, speaking in a tone that was both mocking and commanding. "Give yourself to me, Michael. I have waited for so long. All your fear, your pain, it's mine. Embrace it, and you will never be alone again." The words echoed through his skull, and he realized with mounting horror that it wasn't just the voice of the clown. It was his own voice, distorted, twisted, as though some dark part of himself had been waiting for this moment of surrender. He was no longer just facing a supernatural horror. He was facing his own inner darkness, magnified and weaponized by the entity that controlled the statue. He clutched the locket tightly, feeling the edges dig into his palm, the pain grounding him, keeping him from slipping fully into the entity's grasp. Memories of his mother, of her warm smile, her protective embrace, flashed through his mind, fighting against the oppressive darkness. She had always warned him, always whispered about the dangers that come from forgetting. He understood now. This creature thrived on lost memories, on unresolved fears. The only way to fight it was to confront it, to face the fear that had haunted him since childhood. Summoning every ounce of courage, Michael raised the locket, holding it up as though it were a shield. The clown's laughter faltered, its grin twitching, as if surprised by his defiance. "You are not real," Michael whispered, though his voice trembled. "You are just a nightmare, a figment, and you cannot have me." The laughter grew furious, the statue's face contorting with rage, but he forced himself to keep going, his voice growing louder. "I remember you, but you are nothing without my fear." The ground shook violently, the mist swirling around him in a frenzy, but he didn't back down. With a final, defiant cry, he smashed the locket against the statue's base, shattering it into pieces. For a brief, blinding moment, the park was filled with a burst of light, the laughter turning into a scream of rage and agony. He felt the darkness recoil, pulling away from him, retreating back into the cracks, leaving him gasping for breath. And then, just like that, it was over. The statue stood silent once more, its grin frozen in place, but lifeless. The mist dissipated, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the park lifted. He staggered back, feeling the emptiness where the locket had been, a bittersweet ache in his heart. He knew he had won, but he also knew he had sacrificed a part of himself to break free. As he turned to leave, the wind carried a faint, distant whisper. Until next time, Michael's heart pounded as he tried to steady himself, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The light that had briefly filled the park faded, but the air remained charged, thick with a tension that felt almost alive. He wanted to believe it was over, that he had broken free from the statue's grip. But as he turned to leave, a chilling realization washed over him. The shadows were still moving. The statue hadn't fully released him. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the final confrontation. The ground trembled beneath him as he took a step back, and he felt a wave of nausea roll over him as the statue's grin twisted, subtly altering until it was no longer just a grin. It was a grotesque, mocking leer, full of malevolence and hunger. The clown's eyes, glassy and wide, began to glow faintly, 2 points of sickly green light that bored into him, piercing through every layer of his defenses. A low rumble echoed from the statue, like the growl of a predator finally ready to strike, and Michael realized, with a sickening dread, that it was not finished with him yet. In a last-ditch effort to escape, he turned and ran, sprinting through the park, his footsteps echoing as he dodged through twisted trees and overgrown paths. But no matter how fast he ran, he could feel the presence of the clown stalking him, its laughter rippling through the air like a tangible force, pressing against him, mocking his desperation. The park had shifted, transformed into a labyrinth of nightmares that seemed to twist and change with each step he took. Paths that should have led him out brought him back to the same spot, the statue's ever-grinning face waiting for him, as if the park itself were folding in on him, trapping him in a pocket of darkness from which there was no escape. Exhausted and out of options, Michael stumbled to a halt, his back pressed against a twisted tree as the statue loomed closer, its stone surface now alive with dark veins that pulsed like blood vessels. The air around it crackled with a sickly energy, and he could feel it draining him, leeching away his strength, his will. Shadows writhed around the clown's feet, reaching out toward him, curling like fingers, eager to drag him into the darkness. His skin crawled as he felt them brush against his ankles, a cold, invasive touch that filled him with a primal fear. A twisted realization dawned on him as he looked into the statue's glowing eyes. It wasn't just trying to scare him. It wanted to consume him, body and soul. The entity within the statue was ancient, older than the park, perhaps older than the town itself, and had been feeding on the fears and memories of those who dared to encounter it for centuries. Michael understood now that he was just the latest in a long line of victims, a source of sustenance for a creature that thrived on terror and despair. And unless he found a way to fight back, he would become another shadow in its collection, another lost soul trapped within the park's twisted realm. Desperation filled him as he searched for anything he could use, any memory or scrap of will that might weaken the clown's hold over him. He thought back to his mother, to her warnings, to the way she had always known there was something evil lurking in this place. She had fought to protect him, to keep him safe from the darkness, and he realized that his love for her was the only thing strong enough to stand against the entity's consuming hatred. Summoning every ounce of courage, he faced the statue one last time, his voice hoarse but steady as he spoke. "You will not have me," he whispered, his words filled with a fierce defiance. "You may feed on fear, but I am more than that. I am more than my nightmares." The statue's laughter faltered, a low hiss escaping from its cracked lips as it recoiled, as if struck by an unseen force. For the first time, Michael saw a flicker of vulnerability in its expression, a hint of fear in its hollow eyes. The shadows around him wavered, and he felt the weight on his soul begin to lift, replaced by a surge of strength he hadn't known he possessed. His defiance was weakening the entity, breaking the cycle of fear it had used to trap him. But the statue wasn't finished yet. With a guttural roar, it lunged forward, its stone limbs cracking and splintering as it moved, reaching out to seize him. Michael braced himself, feeling the cold grip close around his wrist, and he screamed, the pain excruciating as the shadows seeped into his skin, threatening to pull him into its dark embrace. Yet he refused to let go of his defiance. Clinging to his memories, his mother's face, her voice, he forced himself to look the statue in the eyes, his gaze unwavering. In a final act of defiance, he drove his fist into the ground, feeling the connection between himself and the earth, a grounding force that kept him tied to the world of the living. The statue let out a shriek, its stone surface cracking and crumbling as the shadows pulled back, retreating into the night. The laughter faded into a pained hiss, and he felt the entity's grip loosen, its power finally waning. As he staggered back, the statue collapsed into a pile of rubble, the shadows dissipating into the air. The park fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the entity dissolved, leaving only the faint echo of its defeated laughter. Exhausted and trembling, Michael stumbled out of the park, the night air cool against his skin. He knew he would carry the scars of this encounter forever, but he had survived. And as he left the cursed park behind, he whispered a quiet promise to himself. He would never forget what he had seen, and he would never let fear consume him again. As dawn's first light broke over the horizon, Michael stumbled out of the park, his clothes torn, his skin marked with scratches and bruises that told of his struggle. His breath came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline of survival fading, leaving him hollow and numb. He turned back for a moment, staring at the entrance of the park, the eerie silence now replaced by the faint sounds of birds chirping. In the morning light, it looked almost peaceful, ordinary, as though the horrors he had endured were nothing but the remnants of a nightmare. But he knew better. Despite his escape, a feeling of unease lingered. The statue was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble, but Michael couldn't shake the sense that something of it remained, hidden in the shadows, watching him even now. His mind replayed the events of the night, the impossible laughter, the haunting whispers, the chilling visions of his past. Each memory was sharp, vivid, etched into his mind in a way that felt as if it would never fade. And deep down, he wondered if the entity had truly been defeated, or if it had merely retreated, lying in wait for another victim. Weeks passed, but the encounter left him changed, haunted by lingering doubts and fears. At night, he would hear faint laughter drifting on the wind, just outside his window, as if the park were calling him back, beckoning him into its twisted depths. Sometimes in his dreams, he would find himself standing before the statue once more, its grotesque grin stretching wider, as if mocking him, daring him to return. He would wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, and it would take hours for him to shake off the feeling that he wasn't alone. The memories clung to him like a shadow, a constant reminder of the terror he had barely escaped. In an attempt to find closure, Michael began researching the history of the park, driven by a need to understand the entity that had almost claimed him. He combed through old records, newspaper clippings, and whispered stories from the town's older residents. To his horror, he discovered a pattern, a long history of disappearances and strange occurrences tied to the park. Families who had once brought their children there had left town abruptly, unwilling to speak of the horrors they had seen. Some spoke of a curse, an ancient malevolence that fed on fear, claiming its victims one by one. Others hinted at an old ritual, a pact that had bound the entity to the park generations ago, trapping it within the statue, waiting for someone to release it. Michael's investigations uncovered rumors of other survivors, those who had encountered the entity and lived to tell the tale. But they were few, and none of them had emerged unscathed. Each one carried a mark, a reminder of their ordeal, an unshakable fear of the dark, an inability to sleep through the night, a shadow that lingered just out of sight. And as he delved deeper, he realized he was now one of them, forever marked by the encounter, bound to the same cycle of fear and mystery. Then, one night, he found something that froze his blood. Tucked away in a dusty archive was an old photograph taken decades ago. In it, a group of children played in the park, laughing and carefree. But in the background, barely visible, stood the statue of the laughing clown. It was smaller then, less grotesque, but the same malicious grin twisted across its face. And beside it, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Michael leaned closer, heart pounding, and recognized the face. It was his mother, younger, but unmistakable. She had been there, long before he had ever set foot in the park. The realization hit him like a blow. His mother had known the truth, had been marked by the same entity, had passed the burden to him unknowingly. The warnings, the lullabies, her fear, they were all part of a twisted inheritance, a curse passed down through generations. And now, it was his burden to bear. Michael left the archive, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. The park, the statue, the entity, they were all still out there, waiting, watching. He could feel its presence even now, lurking in the recesses of his mind, a faint whisper at the edge of his consciousness. The curse was not something he could escape. It was a part of him, woven into his very being. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. As he walked home, the faint sound of laughter drifted through the cool night air, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But Michael knew better. He knew that one day the park would call him back, and when that time came, he would have to face the darkness once more. For now, all he could do was live with the knowledge, haunted by the mystery that would never truly leave him. And so he walked into the night, forever bound to the secrets of the laughing clown, knowing that the terror he had faced was only a fragment of the evil that lay hidden, waiting patiently in the shadows, for the next soul brave or foolish enough to enter its cursed domain.